There are times where research really impacts a local population, and to just publish in English is not helpful.
In the UK, the National Health Service apparently spends 40 times more in interpreting than translation.
There does seem to be huge appetite amongst translators to shift how they're recognised in game localization.
And welcome everyone to SlatorPod. Hi, Anna.
Hi, Florian.
Today we have a really special conversation with Avi Staiman, CEO of Academic Language Experts. Super interesting niche. I mean, they're working in author services, including translation for the academic publishing space. It's quite a large market. I kind of underestimated it going into the podcast, but very interesting. Listen to it. Today on the agenda, we do rapid fire news, Anna. So we're going to talk about Telus pulling its bid for Appen, briefly data for AI space. You know a thing or two about Appen, don't you?
Yeah, my old employer.
There you go. We're going to talk about an acquisition in the dubbing space, translators in the credits. There's this movement on Twitter. Then we talk about privacy risks emerging from large language models, which we tried to unpack a couple of times, probably unsuccessfully so, but it's a topic that's cluttering up at least my Twitter feed because I'm following so many NLP people. And then we're going to talk about total language services spend of the UK's ginormous National Health, is it service?
Yeah, National Health Service.
All right, and don't forget to register for SlatorCon Remote. Really excited about our speaker lineup forming. We actually have Asana's localization manager joining a panel, and Asana is one of my top 2 favorite SaaS tools, right? It's Asana and it's Canva. So, you know, we had Rachel from Canva on the pod and at SlatorCon Remote, and now we're getting Asana to represent as well. So, but first, the headline that we wrote, and it was Linebridge AI buyer Telus abruptly abandons $700 million Appen bid. Dollar, that is $700 million US dollars. Now, we had to add Linebridge AI buyer Telus because people probably wouldn't have been familiar with the name Telus. It's like a giant kind of telecom outsourcing contact center company in Canada, and they did buy Linebridge's data for AI business about 18 months ago, roughly, at what turned out to be the peak of the kind of data for AI cycle there. So Linebridge offloaded this for $1 billion. Amazing deal by John Fennelly. And since then, things have gone south, at least for Appen, which is a core competitor of Linebridge AI, right? So their stock peaked in probably about mid-2020, and since then fell by about 80%. Because, you know, probably because of additional competition, but also some other factors there. Anyway, so this probably the fall in the share price led to Telus making a unsolicited bid for Appen, right? Appen is listed on the stock market, so you can just come in and start bidding. So they said Appen said they received an indicative proposal, unsolicited, conditional, and non-binding from Telus on May 26th. And then a day later, like when the whole thing became public, I think an Australian newspaper, the Australia Financial Review. Is that a big Australian newspaper?
Yep. It's the most important financial coverage, yes, in the country.
Got it. So someone leaked that to them, and then Appen had to come out and confirm that. And then like overnight, Telus pulled the bid, and Appen even said they were trying to contact Telus's bankers and didn't get through. And so, well, the whole thing shelved. The stock rallied like 25% on the news of the bid and then kind of fell back to where it traded before. Yeah, interesting. So, you know, Appen, it's kind of adjacent to what we cover generally, but they do a lot of also language data annotation and things like that. So that's why we have them on our radar. And of course, with Linebridge, that deal, became industry relevant because Linebridge obviously now is a core localization company, but they spun off that Linebridge AI business. And so we covered it. Interesting. And it only came a couple of weeks after something somewhat similar happened with RWS, right? Where they had a suitor, like a bidder coming in from Hong Kong private equity firm. And then that private equity firm also abandoned the bid. So a bit of corporate drama there. Less corporate drama in the Nordics when there was a deal in the dubbing space. So tell us a bit more about that.
Yes, so media localization provider Dubbing Brothers, they're based in France. They acquired Eurotroll. So that's a Scandinavian dubbing and subtitling company.
Can we just dwell on the name for a second?
It's great.
Eurotroll. That's an awesome name for a company. Eurotroll. I mean, obviously Scandinavia, troll, different connotations, right? And I'm sure this name is older than like the internet meme of trolling, but I mean, Eurotroll, fantastic name.
Yeah, they were founded 30 years ago and it was a family company. So yes, this predates the meme.
There you go.
This is part of their strategy to expand further into Europe. Dubbing Brothers already have a presence in Belgium, Germany, Italy, and Spain, and also in the US. And by acquiring Eurotroll, they're adding on offices in Sweden, Denmark, and Finland. And then now have access to a total of 120 recording and mixing studios worldwide. So really expanding their footprint there.
I wonder what that means, having access to it. I'm sure we pulled that from the PR. So they probably don't own 120 recording and mixing studios, but they can leverage that, right? I mean, 120 studios seems like super large.
It does seem like a lot, especially that's 5, 6, 7, 8 countries. So I don't know if that includes partnerships or some other type of arrangements.
So what do we know about Eurotroll?
As I said, it was a family company founded 30 years ago. Their revenue in 2020 was $4.2 million, but it does look like that represents a bit of a dip. It was 20% down from 2019 and it looks like that could have been pandemic related. So we don't have access yet to the 2021 figures, but we would imagine might see a bit of a difference there. Their big name clients include BBC Worldwide, NBC Universal, and they worked on a lot of kind of well-known projects focusing on kids' entertainment. The Paddington movie was one of the highlights, and the two Lego movies. So their press release said that the CEO of Eurotroll, who's Oscar Svensson, he's going to join Dubbing Brothers and continue growing and focusing on that Scandinavian market.
Got it. So we have to disclose also that I think the revenue figures we got from regulatory filings, I think in Sweden it's all super transparent. You have to like upload your annual report. And so we're assuming this is the parent company, but we don't have it 100% confirmed. So yeah, but seems realistic, that figure. Moving on to gaming, right? From media localization to gaming, we like those two verticals. They're growing strongly. They're interesting. They're servicing kind of fun end markets.
Yeah, and this story is hashtag Translators in the credits. So we covered this online movement that's using this hashtag that's pushing for translators to be named in game credits. Translators are often not named in game credits, but of course they're playing a huge role there in getting all of these games out to into global markets. So there's this very active online Twitter discussion driven mainly by translators about this topic. And this hashtag is being used to share examples where translators have been credited or not. One of the examples that was cited is this game series called Total War. It was translated into 12 languages in 2018. No translators were credited. And then in subsequent releases, they did credit the language service providers. And they also credited the production babies, so the names of babies born to people who were producing the game. But still the translators didn't get their names in. So that provoked a bit of a reaction. And online, a few language service providers have kind of thrown their support behind the movement. One of the LSPs supporting it is Tokyo-based video game localization company called Dragon Baby. And yes, Slator's coverage, the news story, attracted a lot of comment on Twitter as well, a lot of retweets. So there does seem to be, a huge appetite amongst translators to shift how they're recognized in game localization.
They should. I mean, I don't recall, but I think doesn't Netflix in the credits, if you actually do like keep watching and you click, right, and you watch the credits, I think they are actually listing the studios, the dubbing studios, and maybe even the dubbing actors that worked on a specific dubbing project. So yeah, I mean, why not? Seems like a quick win for the game developers to do the same thing in game credits.
There's a parallel movement, I think, in literary translation, almost exactly the same kind of movement and timing for literary translators to get their names on the covers, or at least the title page of books.
And if you're curious about how the academic publishing space handles it, the crediting of translators, stay tuned. We'll discuss with Avi in about 30 minutes. Maybe less, probably 30 minutes. Yes, that's when we, probably halfway through the podcast, we start talking about it. So large language models may leak personal data. Studies show, very briefly, large language models, trillions of billions of parameters. We spoke about it before, can do all kinds of things, right? Have been all the talk of the NLP community for the past, half year. Don't listen to me when trying to summarize what they are and how they work. But what is apparently happening, and there's been a couple of papers, one of them by Nicholas Carlini, research scientist at Google, who says that as language models continue to advance, new and unexpected risks can be exposed, requiring the research community to proactively work to develop new ways to mitigate potential problems. Now, what does that mean? One of it is that actually private personal data is getting kind of indirectly leaked. I think if I understand this correctly, it says you can query these large language models for personal information. So you could kind of ask, like, what's Tom's, Smith email address, and then the model would actually return it because it found it somewhere on the internet, right? And there's all kinds of other data that you could argue that kind of a malicious actor could try to get out of these models. So interesting. Like it's almost like semi-AI, like, you're unleashing the power of like a semi-intelligent thing that like knows the entire internet. And I mean, obviously, you can just punch in stuff into Google, which may result in certain things, but maybe if these models are trained on non-public information, you could query it and get access to that. So an interesting new problem set that's emerging with these large language models.
When Google released their Palm model, they did attract criticism for not making it publicly accessible. But the counter argument to that is that there are a lot of risks around making these huge models available as well.
Isn't that super weird that there's risks involved into making things accessible? I mean, eventually the genie is going to get out of the bottle and somebody is going to use these things, right? So yeah, we should get an expert on it. I said it a couple of times, but it's becoming more pressing. Now, more down to earth, in the UK, the National Health Service apparently spends 40 times more in interpreting than translation. What's that all about?
Yeah, this figure comes from a new report from Inbox Translation. They're a London medical language service provider. They don't hold contracts with the NHS, but what they did do was submit a huge number of freedom of information requests to National Health Service trusts across England, Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland. And they obtained a lot of data that showed that annual spending on translation and interpreting at the UK's National Health Service reached £66 million. That's about $82 million in 2019 to 2020. And the vast majority of that spending was on interpreting, so around 85%, with the remainder on British Sign Language, and only a really small percentage was on translation, around £1.5 million, or 2% of the total spend.
I'd assume that's quite indicative of like other large health systems. I mean, there's few that are as centralized as the UK's, right? But yeah, seems maybe this is quite, so 2% only in translation. Maybe there's others that use a little more, but I mean, generally, I guess the overwhelming part of the business there would be for interpreting.
A quick caveat is that the majority of organizations from whom Inbox acquired data didn't break down the spending between interpreting and translations. So these figures are kind of extrapolated based on the organizations that do break it down. And they made a kind of main recommendation that moving forward, if these organizations can maintain comprehensive and consistent data on translation and interpreting services spent, that's going to help them improve service coverage and cost effectiveness.
Do we know why they ran this? Like, what's Inbox Translation's incentive there?
Yeah, one of the things that they one of the things they noted is that there hasn't been a report or a study like this for several years. And secondly, the amount that the NHS was spending on interpreting and translation had gained a bit of press in the UK. There was some criticism saying the government's spending too much. These figures are exorbitant. So they wanted to dig in and find out what the actual numbers were. And what they found is that this spend actually represents just 0.057% of the organization's total expenditure. So really not a major cost for them.
Absolutely. And I mean, it's kind of impressive they could pull those figures at all. I mean, if you tried to pull like Switzerland's overall healthcare interpreting spend, it would be completely impossible. There's like 500 organizations you'd have to ask. And there's a lot of them are like semi-private or private, so there's no way of getting that data. Anyway, so let's get over and talk to Avi Staiman of Academics Language Experts. Really fascinating discussion, so stay tuned. And welcome back, everyone, to SlatorPod. Today, we're really happy to have Avi Staiman join us today. So Avi is the CEO of Academic Language Experts. They provide editing, translation, publication support for scholars. So Avi, where does this podcast find you today? What city, what country?
I'm actually in what some call the heart of the world, Jerusalem, Israel. Originally born and raised in the States, but moved here about 15 years ago.
Got it. So let's talk a bit about your background first before we talk about your company, which is very, very interesting. So you spent some time in the education sector. So tell us about your academic background and how you ended up in I use ended up, but what drew you to the language industry? Let's put it that way.
No, you're right in saying ended up, because it was entirely by mistake. I did not, when I was younger, didn't have any idea about the language sector. Can't say I was much of a language enthusiast. But basically I guess you could call it the origin story, is that I was pursuing my bachelor's degree in education, which was really a passion of mine. And I had a number of courses that were in Hebrew, being that I was studying in Israel. And I asked some of my lecturers and my professors to write my papers in English. There was one professor who took a liking to, I guess, the style of writing that I had, and asked me after the end of a course if I could help him translate his manuscript for publication with a Cambridge journal. And, ignorance is bliss. So I said, yeah, how hard could that be? I'll go ahead and do that. And about 5-6 months later, I realized exactly how hard it could be. And that was sort of my introduction into the world of translation, into the world of academic publication. And that was sort of the seed, it wasn't the next day that I started the business, but that was sort of the seed that started the process of thinking about, being in the language industry. And really, as I went along and sort of, tried out the teaching thing and, got my first pay slip, then I noticed, okay, I'm going to need to do some other work to make this work. And over time, sort of fell in love with the business of translation and editing, and kind of made that the primary, my primary occupation, and have been fully involved for the last 7 years.
7 years. All right. So Academic Language Experts is a little different from maybe what I would call kind of the corporate LSP. So why don't you give us the kind of extended elevator pitch so listeners understand a bit more what you do and who you work with?
Yeah, so we actually sit on, I would say, the crossroads between the language industry and the academic research industry. So I'll explain what I mean, I think, with a very simple and easy to understand example, which is that, we all, as citizens of the world, we're hoping for a vaccine for a number of years, and we're relying on researchers and research to produce such a vaccine. But we also wanted to make sure that it was fully peer-reviewed, validated, and checked that it was entirely accurate. Now, what happens is that that's perfectly fine for a scholar that maybe has a full team of researchers and writers and editors around them. However, what if you're a researcher from a country where English is not your native language? It's really important to make sure that your research is in pristine shape before submitting it to an academic journal for publication. And that's really the way that research gets validated, is by going through the peer review process and being published. So if you've ever heard of Nature or the New England Journal of Medicine, these are sort of the standard bearers of what makes research, what makes fact, right? And what makes research something that we can rely on and trust. And even with all those checks, there's still a lot of questioning of science over the last few years. So what we're here to do is actually help a segment in the market, which is quite large, which are those researchers that primarily are not publishing in English, to help them along that journey. So sometimes that means they'll write in their native language and then we'll translate it for them. Sometimes that means that they're writing in English and we're editing it for them. Sometimes people are going from English to other languages. There are all sorts of communicative paths that happen in the research world, and we're here to help facilitate that and make that happen. And the truth is, over the last few years, the reason why I say we're sort of, half in the LSP industry and half not, is because we also have sort of branched out with more specialized services, including, peer review. So helping scholars review their work before it's sent off to the journal to give them a higher chance of getting accepted. We help research institutions with their grant proposals. So if they're applying to the National Institute of Health in the U.S. or the European Union, European Commission in the EU, or all sorts of funding opportunities, to really give them the best chance to succeed and make sure that language is not only a barrier, but actually serves as an advantage after having worked with us. But I guess that's similar to a lot of LSPs now, who are understanding that it's not enough just to be a generic sort of, translation service, but actually need to focus on a specific niche and really get a deep understanding and knowledge of what they need and try and provide them those services to best serve them.
100%. So, but how do you find your clients? If the clients are individual researchers, like, do you work with big universities, big institutions, and that's how you source them? Or do they even find you like on their own?
Yeah, really good question. So when I started out, I said to myself, I want to make sure that the model works, and I want to make sure that we're really providing true value over, competitors or over maybe independent translators. And I want to iron out all the wrinkles, maybe even a little bit too perfectionist, iron out all the wrinkles before we go and start pitching our services to the big research institutions and funding bodies. So I would say the first 3 or 4 years really was just making sure that we had a process and a system that worked. What I've been able to do over the last 2 to 3 years is move from just what we call in business, I call it B2B. In our industry, we call it scholar to scholar support, and really move to scholar to institution. And what that means is that we're helping now institutions, and the end service is oftentimes similar, right? The service doesn't change just because we're working with institutions, because institutions are made up of teams of scholars and researchers. However, the difference, it is very different in terms of the approach and the pitch and how you communicate. So for example, with an individual scholar, we want to talk to them about all the wonderful journals and all the funding that we help get. With a research institute or with a research authority who sort of oversees research, we want to talk about how can you improve the quantity and quality of the research that's coming out of your institution so that your university will be ranked higher. I'm sure you've seen, university rankings, 1 year Harvard's at the top, the next year, Cambridge is at the top. Well, where do those come from? So there's a whole, system for figuring that out. One of the big things is how much money are they bringing in from external institutions for funding, and how much, and where are their scholars? What sort of a sum total of where their scholars have published and what the level of those publications are. So that's really kind of our approach that we've been taking for the last few years with institutions, is how do we help your university, your college, if you're a publisher and you're trying to get, compete for authors, for scholars to come in and publish with you, how do you up your game to really get to the point where you have a competitive advantage over the other scholars out there? And the truth is that over the past few years, especially since Corona, there's just been a boom in the number of submissions to these top level journals. So the competition is harder than ever, and therefore the requirement or need for really high quality writing is more pressing than ever before.
Maybe that pertains my ignorance. When I want to ask you about preprint, like or at what point would they come to you? Only when they're planning to submit to a major journal, or like when they even like publish something on, and we're following Archive, for example, because there's a lot of like language and machine translation research in there. So at what point would they say, well, okay, now I'm going to actually engage a professional service provider, and I'm obviously going to also spend some money?
We're going to get a little bit into the weeds here, but I think it's a really important, I'm glad that you asked about preprints, because most people in the language industry aren't necessarily familiar with what they are. So let's start with defining what preprints mean. Until now, the process has simply been you work on your article, and you submit it to a journal. Most of the time, it's going to get about 90% of the time, 80 to 90% of the time, it's going to get rejected. If it's to a top level journal, it could be 95% of the time it's going to get rejected. You get it back. Hopefully you get some comments and you move on to the next journal and hope for better luck there. And that process is really tedious. I mean, you're talking about a process that could take 2 or 3 years to just get from the time we're not talking about 2 or 3 years for the research, 2 or 3 years after you're done writing till it gets published. And then the results become outdated. So, and really, the pandemic was a smack in the face, because it's like, well, we can't afford to wait 2-3 years for research to be published, right? We need this now. But how do we make sure that it's really of high quality? So preprints, it was around before the pandemic, but I think it's really given it quite the boost. The concept of a preprint is that I'm going to post my results before they ever, are validated or peer reviewed or anyone's ever checked them. Okay. Now the advantage of that is that I can get it up there right away. I can actually claim my rights over my research, and no one can steal my research because I've published it in a certain place, so it's sort of copyrighted. And in addition, other scholars can come onto this preprint forum, which is a website, and basically give me feedback and say, you know what, you should change this, you should change that. And all these things are happening before I ever get it published. So there's a lot of advantages and benefits to it. And I think the publishers are realizing, wow, someone's kind of going upstream and getting these leads well before we are. And they're sort of trying to figure out how to contend with that. There are downsides, and I want to be clear about that, which is that a journalist who's covering the pandemic doesn't necessarily know how to distinguish between a preprint and a published article, and may just quote "and then happened," meaning this isn't theoretical. It happened where preprints were quoted, later disproved, and decision makers were making decisions based on not peer-reviewed research. So there's a danger here, and there's sort of a risk that's involved. Now, to answer the question of how do we get involved, so this is all the entire industry is actually moving earlier and earlier. If until now we kind of waited until scholars were about to publish and then help them, what we've been trying to do since the beginning, and I see the industry is kind of following along, is saying, no, scholars need help actually at earlier stages of the process. They may need help in, with reviewing, with helping them, sort of coaching them through while they're stuck on certain points of the research, when they experience writer's block. They may need help suggesting which journals they should be submitting to. If they have a book, they may need help with their book proposal that they want to make a pitch to a publisher and get their feedback on. And that's kind of some of the work that we've been doing, is kind of moving earlier and earlier in the process so we can capture those people and then help them along more sort of stops along the way. And I think that's sort of where the industry is kind of headed, because they realize that if you wait too long, then you actually may not capture those people when they're ripe and when they really need the most help.
Got it. In terms of the language that you're helping in, is that like 100% English, or for translations always into English, and then all the editing and the support, that's always English?
I would say in terms of our business, it's probably about 80% into English and 20% into other languages. That's not including the English language editing. So about 90% of research is published in English. There is a nice counter trend now. There are certain journals that publish in other languages. There are certain journals that will be bilingual. So they'll publish in English and Spanish, or English and French. There is a nice, I think, awareness and understanding that's happened more recently, in that there are times where research really impacts a local population, and to just publish in English is both silly and also not helpful, right? And meaning there was I remember a call that I had with a scholar from South America who was researching poverty among children in South America. And she was approaching me about support with publishing the article in English. Now, I said to her, I'm happy to help. Out of curiosity, who's like going to benefit the most from this? So she said, well, local decision makers. I said, are they going to read this paper in English? It's academic. It's dense enough as it is. Are they really going to understand it? And she said to me, no, but that's what I need to, go to progress in my career. Maybe later I'll translate it back into Spanish. And to me, that's a travesty, because it's like, well, why are we doing the research in the first place if it's not to help people? So there is, and it's we actually just have been getting an uptick in the number of actual like oftentimes they're NGOs or they're sort of research institutes, not necessarily universities, who are seeing the value in translating out of English to local languages, which I think is also really important. But that so long as the lingua franca of academia is English, I think the vast majority of our business will continue to be to English. Now, that is from all sorts of languages. That spread really, that's a pretty wide spread. So we're translating from Japanese, German, French, Spanish, Hebrew, Arabic, Italian, etc. Really any country where scholars are, where the native language isn't English, but scholarship is really done at a high level.
Would you say that English has peaked at a like 80, 90% level, and from here on out, it's looks like it's going to remain the lingua franca, but these niches will prevail, or is there maybe still a bit of an uptick for English?
It's a bit of a it's a bit of a Tower of Babel situation in the sense that we need a shared language of science in order to communicate, right? We need to be right. When I'm talking about, sorry to reuse this example, but when I'm talking about a vaccine, you need to understand what I'm talking about. And the scholars around the world we need to have a shared terminology. Otherwise, we're just talking past each other. However, the downside of that becomes that when everything is in English, so what does it do? First of all, it's been proven in research that non-native English scholars, or as the more I guess the politer term is, the English as an additional language, EAL scholars, or English as a second language, those scholars are at a disadvantage. Research has proven that they will not get their articles accepted as often as native English speakers. So that's an issue that we should address regardless of what language is being published in. In terms of, but do I think there will be additional efforts made to reach other populations? Yes. We're working for a journal that comes out of NYU that understands this point and has hired us to translate 6 of their articles in their upcoming issue into Arabic, because they realize that's the population who really needs it. So I don't think that all of a sudden you're going to start seeing, the major journals that I mentioned before, Nature, New England Journal of Medicine, Cell, I don't think you're going to start seeing them publishing in other languages. You may see some of these publishers providing sort of automated real-time machine translation, so that scholars who go online can quickly peruse an article and see if it's relevant to them. So that you may see an uptick in that. But I think that the for now the language of publication is English, and I don't see that changing anytime soon. The total market is growing. That I will say. From what I saw a report where there was an estimation that the author services market, which is a very broad term that sort of covers all support in writing for scholars, is expected to grow from about 1 billion to 2 billion over the next year or two. So it's a growing market, that's of interest, because I think more and more scholars from around the world are trying to publish. There are dozens of new journals that are being opened up and created daily. There are new publishers all over the place. So it's definitely a growing market.
Massive, those numbers, right? And I do agree with you that people, or with the research, of course, that people whose native language isn't English are at a disadvantage. I mean, sometimes I wonder how easy it would be if I could just speak Swiss German all the time, just native. And one thing is also, it's how much of a challenge for you is, it's a bit of a geeky language question, but like all of these emerging new concepts in English that may not even exist in some of these other languages, that like you're basically doing like frontline linguistic work by translating out of or into English these kind of emerging new concepts.
One of the first articles I ever translated was heavy on Foucault. And if you're familiar with Foucault, he French philosopher, he invents all sorts of words that didn't exist before, and then this scholar was inventing words based on those words that don't really exist. So that's it. My hat is off to the translators and editors that work at ALE, because at Academic Language Experts, because they really have to. It's not advertising. They could just be creative and kind of come up with whatever they want, but it's also not a list of medical supplies where it's just like, technical. It's a combination of real deep understanding of the source text, which oftentimes, like you said, is totally novel and niche, right? If it's not novel, it's not research, right? It's just regurgitation of previous, right? Everything has to be new and novel. On the flip side, if you're not creative in the way that you convey the messaging and ideas, and you swap out the idioms and you come up with parallel, and you don't come up with parallel terms, you're going to miss the point. And that's what makes, sometimes I ask myself, why did you pick the hardest, sort of niche to specialize in? Because it's hard, but you know what? Can I tell you something? I have so much, I like to say that we have, that if we've done nothing else, we've managed to put in the same virtual room the most just brilliant translators, because many of them are academics themselves, right? How do they know academia? Because they are adjunct lecturers, or they retired from the profession. They're independent scholars, or they've done an advanced degree in translation, but are really, fascinated and read up on academia and read academic journals. So it's not a challenge, it's 100% a challenge. But the way I see it, every challenge is also an opportunity, right? So because maybe it scares off others, where they say, okay, I'll just stick to, medical texts that just repeat themselves. We actually embrace the constant creativity and constant being challenged to sort of think anew about the ideas that we're reading, and also about how we convey those in the best way possible. And I think that's kind of what makes us unique and a little bit different from some of the other traditional LSPs.
100%. So tell me a bit more about like the workflow, how the authors, the linguists, the researchers, the editors, how do they all work together? Like maybe taking like a kind of a case study almost.
Yeah, that's a really good question. Okay, so a traditional sort of, typical project, let's say we're talking about, a scientific article that a scholar contacts us about. They'll generally contact us via our website. We have a very easy to use sort of, high level website where people can kind of upload their projects automatically without us needing to be involved. We'll review that text internally and send out a price quote. Assuming the scholar approves that, we then have two levels, or essentially two steps. The first step is either translation or editing by a subject expert. So we have, and we built an algorithm where we match up based on the criteria of the project. We match it up to the best generally freelance translator or editor for that particular project. And what I love is that sometimes you've got a project from, Chicago that's being done by an editor, across the world in New Zealand, and we're here in Israel, and everyone's sort of working like clockwork. I mean, one of my favorite examples is we do some work for the Trudeau Foundation in Canada, and they outsource to us their translations from English to French, which is so ironic because they're sitting in Montreal and they've got literally, French all around them, but yet they outsource to us in Israel because we really kind of have come up with a really, pinpointed system for how to evaluate, how to sort of sift through, how to identify the best people for the academic work, and then how to assign them to exactly the right projects. So that work is done. That draft is done. It's then sent on to one of our reviewers. Some of our reviewers are internal. Some of our reviewers are external, depending on the field, depending on the subject area, the language set. And they do a secondary review of that translation or that edit to make sure it's really up to the highest quality. And one thing that we've learned is really we can't go without that secondary review. The secondary review turns it from a translation to a publishable article. And really what we've started selling is publication ready text. That's what we're really in the business of. Obviously, translation is sort of the way to get there. But if we just give someone a draft, I know there are LSPs that will offer different sort of service levels. We go all out on every project because we realize if we're getting someone half the way there and they get rejected by the journal, they've spent a bunch of money, they're not happy, and they end up coming back to us anyway. So let's go all out for everything. And price, build that into the pricing model. And then we have clients who are super loyal, right? They're return clients, right? Academia is publish or perish, right? So if you're not publishing, you don't exist. So it's clients that are coming back over and over and over. And B is it's a very tight knit community. As soon as we, latch on to one scholar in one department, all of a sudden within a few months, we could have all the work from that department because scholars say, here, use these guys. They're use academic language experts. They're really excellent. So that second stage of review is really critical for us. Oftentimes that involves us getting involved in the editing. And then we send it on to the client. The client has their opportunity to review, ask questions, leave comments, have a back and forth until they feel entirely satisfied and are ready to submit it. Now, obviously, there are different sort of upsells along the way. Some scholars will ask for formatting, where in addition to the translation, we're actually making sure that the template is exactly according to whatever target journal they're aiming for, which is really important in scholarship and research. There are times where people ask us to help them find the right journal for their research. So there's all sorts of, kind of creative ways that we upsell along the way. But the main sort of, process is pretty consistent, which allows us to build a system which is really scalable, right? That's really been my goal since day one, is not to be so over reliant on, or over customized. We want every scholar to have their individual experience and feel like they're the center of our attention. But we also want to have a system which can be duplicated and run over and over and over. And all we need to do is make small tweaks to the system here or there. Right before we came on, I was, sort of tweaking little things on our form to make sure that everything is optimized. And that way we can really build, we've been able to grow over the last year by about 25%. And I think that's as a result, and thanks to the fact that we've really looked at the big picture and seen how do we help scholars as a group, how do we help research institutions as a group and not just each individual scholar.
Got it. Like yours is a very kind of particular challenge in terms of the service you deliver, in terms of the linguists you're using. How does kind of the off-the-shelf TMS cat tool stack work for you or not? And how much are you leveraging like language technologies such as machine translation or not? And if not, why, right? Like how do you balance those two? Super customization versus having some of these off-the-shelf technologies available?
Yeah, so we definitely face a challenge when it comes to some of the automated tools. Because of the novelty of the research, the level of repeatability is quite low, right? Meaning that even if two people are sitting next to each other in a department, it doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to be using the same words, same terminology. So the level of repetition isn't that great. I mean, it may be over the course of 30 years of a scholar working with us, there'll be some repetition. But even then, if they're not sort of introducing new ideas and concepts, they're dead. So that definitely presents a unique challenge. Many of our translators, are using CAT tools, which help them with their own work. It may help, because they have a certain term base that's already there. But in put it this way, I think we've made a strategic decision to go up market, and what I mean by that is there are automated solutions, even that are tailored for the academic world, and I obviously keep a close eye on the solutions. Our experience has been until now that there's a lot more that goes into translating an academic article or editing an academic article than sort of technical automated points. And in fact, sometimes editing, actually there was an article up on Slator a few weeks ago from a professor named Anna. I'm forgetting her last name. It's a brilliant article. I really loved it. She did a study. I actually interviewed her for my podcast because I was just so taken aback by the study. But essentially, the study showed what they did was they compared the same translators translating the text from scratch to those same translators editing a machine translation of a literary text. And I consider academic text to be in a similar category as academic, even though there are differences between them. And what she found is that there was a significant difference in the reader experience between those texts that were translated from scratch and those that were post-machine translation edited. And that's kind of been our, and I'm making, it's a calculated risk in terms of as a business owner, right? To go in that direction and to say, we're going to go upstream and we're really going to give people, that sort of white glove kind of a service. I have no doubt that over time, some of these tools can help supplement. We already use tools. I'll tell you where we use tools the most is proofreading. To make sure that our work there's a lot of really good proofreading tools out there that we use that kind of help us, in making sure that we didn't overlook anything because, humans make mistakes, but we really believe in the creative flair of the individual. That obviously, is I guess a little bit against the grain, you would say, in terms of LSPs. And I am always experimenting and continuing to experiment with machine and automated tools just because I want to be up to date. So I'm not ideologically against, but so far we've seen, put it this way, we see a very high net promoter score. We see a very high return score. We see success. So if it ain't broke, don't fix it. And that's kind of been my approach. And so far, so good.
I think, yeah, you could argue that once it's ready, or it's at that quality level that makes sense for you, it could be not trivial, but could be possible to introduce it still at that point. And if you don't see value yet at this point in time, then like, yeah, why kind of force it into a field that for now doesn't really, make sense? I love what you said about the repetitions. I mean, yeah, it's almost a red flag if there's too much repetition, right? If a researcher, I've written this entire paragraph, I probably shouldn't reuse it now, right? So it's almost a control tool there.
You can get in trouble as an academic if you quote yourself. That's considered self-plagiarism. Meaning if let's say you're saying, here's what I said last year, you get flagged for that. So what you're saying is not only true in a general sense, it's true in a very specific sense. You cannot have more than like 5% of your text repeat any other text that's ever been created in the history of man. So by definition, you're not allowed to have repetition. So that's why it's sort of like, like I said, runs against the grain of sort of typical, translation work.
I love that. That's such a nice edge case right there. Hey, so we recently had a tweet go viral about a campaign in the game localization space where they're pushing for translators to be in the credit of the game. What about academic work? Are translators mentioned, credited, named anywhere or not?
Yeah, that's a really big point. You can go onto any sort of online forum of academic translators, and you are bound within the first few posts to see something about that, because there is a certain level of a problem there. As a general rule, scholars are given credit for books. In fact, in many countries, there's a legal requirement to mention the translator, which when I was early on in this business, I had a translator call me up and said, listen, I'm suing the publisher. And I said, what? You got paid, your book is out. He said, my name is not in there. I want them to recall all of the books that they've sold and put my name in. And I didn't laugh, but I was like, that sounds unreasonable. And he was right legally. In the end, they reached some sort of an agreement. But I, much more careful now to make sure that translators always get credit. I also think it's the right thing to do. And, that people have told me, well, maybe they're just going to jump straight to the translator and not go through. There's enough added value that we're providing along the way, significant added value that doesn't concern me. And I really do believe that the translators are our most important asset. So treating them right will lead to much greater things than trying to sort of put them behind, hide them in the closet. Now, that's just for books. For most other academic work, there is no credit given. So you open up a journal, you are not going to see. I try and push our clients to consider it. There's a certain industry norm where it doesn't happen. I do kind of a gentle push because I want them to think about it and consider it and then make their own decision about it. And there have been scholars that have, as a result, given us credit, and we really do appreciate that. But as a norm, it is sort of like, the translator is very much invisible. I think it's a problem. I don't see any reason why translators shouldn't be given full credit. If the illustrator and the designer and the, typography guy and, if they're all given credit, the translator should very well be given credit as well. It's an issue. It's an issue, and it needs lobbying, and it needs education, and it needs, to be brought up. So, we do our part in trying to raise awareness about that, but it's definitely not where we would want it to be. And there's more work to be done there.
Got it. So let's look a bit into the future, your outlook this year, next year. And you mentioned some of these other non-translation services, broader services, author services. What are you most excited about? Where are you putting your priorities this year and next year?
Yeah, so there's two real ways to kind of go here. One is upstream and one is downstream. So first, let's talk about once. So we've kind of been in this position of right before you're about to go submit your article or your book, you come and you get help with us. That's still our core business. But there's two ways to go. So one way is to go wait till after publication, or even the same scholars we help them publish. There's more and more of an emphasis being put on the impact, right? Okay, great. You've published your article in a journal. Who cares, right? Who's reading it? If Florian opens this up, is he going to understand what the hell I'm talking about? Most of the time, the answer is no, and it has nothing to do with your intelligence, which is perfectly fine. It has to do with it's written in a very complex, convoluted, complicated way. thankfully, I think there's a sort of the pendulum is swinging a little bit back towards an emphasis on understandable and clear writing, which I think is really great. But there are a lot of things that can be done to kind of transform research into sort of bite-sized pieces that people can understand and digest. So, for example, that might be an executive summary of a page or two written in lay language, which, by the way, can be really important. If a donor is giving $2 million to a university to pay for cancer research and then can't understand what the hell he just spent money on, he's not going to re-up his donation. So that's really important. Or if a scholar is trying to have an impact on legislation that's being passed and be an important and the lawmakers don't know what's being said, they can't do it. So we're talking about writing pieces for legislation, writing media sort of news press releases and news reports, turning your article into something which could be picked up by CNN or BBC or a major news outlet, because that could totally make your career. We're talking about executive summaries, donor and layman's reports. So that's sort of what I call the post-publication services or impact services. How do you make sure that your research that is published gets to where it needs to go? On the flip side, so really we're thinking about what do scholars need in order to get published, not just what language services do they need. So some of the things that we've sort of launched over the last year or two, I would say, is starting with grants, so grant consultation and grant review. So in order to fund your research, you generally need to get money from a leading institution, from the European Union, the European Research Council, the National Institute of Health, and you need to be able to sort of once you have that funding, then you have a whole lab that can work with you. Until then, you're sort of stuck. So to help them get the funding. After they get the funding, so then they're doing the research, but oftentimes they don't have a statistician, or they don't have someone who can external who can review the article, or in the case of humanities and social sciences, they want to publish a book, but they don't really know how to approach an acquisitions editor and sell them on the project. So those are the services that we're building out, that we're really trying to help with. A, because they help the scholars, but B, because they also are attractive to the institutions who say, oh, you can help us bring more, money into the institution. You can help us raise our, profile among the universities of the world, get more money from the government. There are a lot of implications to publishing well. So those are sort of some of the strategic things that we've done. Part of a big emphasis of what we've done over the last year is we signed a contract with Brill, which is one of the major humanities and social sciences publishers. In the world, we signed a contract with Hindawi, which is a major STEM publisher. So that's another way to kind of expand our services, is to say, okay, instead of just helping the individual scholar to scholar, how do we help publishers give author services to their authors so that when they get the research into their in their inbox, it's ready to go. It doesn't require all of the heavy lifting that used to need to be done in order to get the research to print. We always are going to be clear. We always want to make sure that research is really top notch. It's always going to need to be peer reviewed. That's really critical. But the process to get there, if a scholar can come in already at 90% instead of being at 15%, it's a total different experience. I mean, I see a large attrition from doctoral students and postdocs who are just like, they get so frustrated with the process because no one teaches it, right? No one actually, in another life, I would start like a school for, how to publish your research. I just don't have time. But it's sort of things you're supposed to kind of figure out along the way, but there's no real rule. There's no clear written rules, guidelines to it. So that's why we do a lot of the educational work that we do as well, through podcasts, through interviews, through our website. We have a very, sort of robust blog that gives people information that you could find on our website, Academic Language Experts, aclang.com. And you can find like a lot of really helpful information there. But even then, it's just the tip of the iceberg in terms of what people actually need. So that's kind of where, the direction we're headed in, is how do we help scholars? Very simply, we want scholars to be able to say, anything I need that has to do with my writing, I just send it to Ailey. And I don't need to think twice about it. And I don't need to say, yeah.
There you go. We end on the elevator pitch. Fantastic.
I guess the elevator would have probably left a long time ago, but so maybe we'll need to cut this and move it to the beginning. But there you go.
It's a tall building.
Yeah, we're in the Empire State Building, so it stopped on every floor.
Awesome. Well, Avi, thanks so much for doing this. It was super interesting.
Yeah, thanks so much, Blair. And I have to say, like, all the Slator content is just awesome. I really, learn a lot every time I watch any of the podcasts and go onto the blog. So, kudos to your hard work and everything that you're doing over there. And yeah, I hope this is sort of like a window into a different kind of niche that maybe some of your listeners and audience haven't really been exposed to before. And if you allow me one more sort of plug or pitch, I really think that there's when we think about the world of research, you can think very like sort of narrow about research institutions, or you can think really big. Pharmaceutical companies are doing a lot of research. Corporate, high tech, they're all doing research, right? So this is actually quite, and a lot of them need to publish, whether it's publishing, a professional report for their board, or whether it's publishing, in actual peer-reviewed journals. This is, don't think about it. I think we sometimes tend to think about the classics professor, who's, got a couple $1,000s, but there's actually quite a big market here when you think about research in the broadest sense of the word. So, that's sort of the direction that we're looking, to partner with, with organizations that can really help us sort of leverage and scale what we've already built, which we think is really valuable, and tap into those more, sort of lucrative markets.
Yeah, I think the number you mentioned there, $1 billion, $2 billion, that sounds reasonable, and definitely a big market that I wasn't really aware of. So that I now am. So thanks for that. Great. We'll cover it more often in the future.
For sure. And I think that we're not looking, just like any good business. It's sort of easy to be tempted by, wow, look at that big number. We're happy if we can carve out, a small percentage of that, but really do things in a really professional way and really help. We define our success by hello, gorgeous. My daughter just walked in at the very end. You can say hello. Say hello to Florian first. Hi.
Hi there.
My apologies. Now I lost my train of thought.
We were with the size of the market.
To me, well, you know what? Part of so I know that I'm really proud of, and I think we've discussed this before, Florian, is trying to find that work-life balance and trying to, to remember that work is really important, but it's not everything, and that, your family and loved ones are, should always be put first. So that's sort of my approach, and I like working with people who are on the same page. And if I remember correctly, that I speak for you as well.
100% here. It's just we have to tell the listeners that your daughter walked in, because they didn't see her walk in, right?
So my daughter walked in and wanted to know what time it was. She's ready for her dance recital. But yeah, again, I'm not interested in I am curious, obviously, doing proper market research, what the total market share, what the size of this market is. But A is, I think it's going to be continually growing, so I don't see that as an issue. And B is, I want to take that small chunk of the market which really does value their own writing and values good writing and values, and really has the support in order to publish high-level research and really help them. There are a lot of, we didn't even get into it, but there are what are called predatory journals, which are sort of journals that are fake. And there are paper mills. So there are AI machines that are coming up with like papers on their own, which are mostly nonsense. So there's a lot in this world that's sort of, a dark underbelly that may account for a small amount, but really we're sort of heading, kind of top of the line services for scholars who really take themselves seriously, really take their career seriously, want to progress in a really substantive way, and are willing to put in the time and effort to do it properly.
Got it. Great. Well, again, thanks so much, and all the best with those plans. A very exciting space you're in.
Appreciate it, Florian. Thanks so much for the invite, and I look forward to continued chatting as time goes along.